I basically thought I'd talk on this subject because there's been a lot of speculation. People have been worried why talks are going on and so on. I just thought I'd like to put the entire peace talks in a certain perspective, both for us as well as people of the Northeast to understand what is the reasons behind, what are the issues which make it so difficult for us to move forward, and it's an inch by inch progress that has gone. I'd like to start with just a brief history, a few minutes. As all of you know, there were different, I call it Naga tribes because that's how they're known today, but not at that time. None of them knew they were Nagas. Nagas itself is a nomenclature given by the British. They have no recorded history or common language. There was never any Naga kingdom or state. We know from the Assam, Burunji and so on that, and the chronicles in Manipur, that they've had interaction with both the Ahom and the Manipur kingdoms. Most of the Naga tribes, and they lived in a free state. They were in that sense sovereign within their area, with village councils. Some had a little bit of a feudal setup. The British first entered the area in 1832. There were a lot of Naga raids, and the first elements of the British outpost to be set up in that area came up. The British had a, what shall I say, a mixed policy. First, they thought they would control from without, that is without outside the area, and subsequently they realized that there were too many attacks by the Nagas, which are basically Angamis, both in what you call as British India areas, and therefore they finally went in and set up the outpost first in Kohima. The Naga Hills came under a separate district in 1866 under the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, and then when Assam was bifurcated from Bengal, the Naga Hills came under Assam in 1874. At that time, when we look at the Naga Hills, it's really the current Kohima and Mokokchung districts alone. I just wanted to bring that. It's not the current Nagaland. Then the British brought in the Scheduled Districts Act 1874, under which the governor of Assam, in one sense, had the direct control over this area. He could decide whether any act of the Assam government needed to be extended or not. He had that powers with him. The British imposed the house tax first on in the Angami villages of rupees 2 per house, and in the non-Angami villages it was rupees 3. 1875 the subdivision at Wokha, 1890 a subdivision at Mokokchung. And then we got the Government of India Act 1919, where the Naga Hill districts was declared a backward tract under the province of Assam. This was not an exclusive thing. There were a number of other backward tracts. The Mizo were backward tracts, the North Kachar was backward tracts, the Garo Hills were backward tracts, and a number of other areas. Subsequently, the Government of India Act 1935 being followed by the excluded area, but still within the province of Assam. This sort of excluded area sort of I'll just highlight this, I'll come back to it earlier. It gave the impression, at least when the NNC and others followed, that they said we are excluded from British India and therefore we were never under part of British India, which is really legally or constitutionally not correct. It is important for us to understand parallel developments to the rise of Naga consciousness. We had the entrance of Christian missionaries, 1872, first baptism, Roman script, documentation of the tribes and clans, introduction of the Nagamese language a little later, and then the First World War, where we believe figures vary, but between 2,000 to 5,000 Naga people went and fought. They were the labor corps. They worked in the labor corps in the First World War, and I think in one sense it was the first major exposure to the world outside. And when they came back, they'd seen this whole world and what is outside. And in 1920, the Naga Club was set up. The Deputy Commissioner, Charles Fossey, had a instrumental role. But the Naga Club was really set up by, Dubashis and, very low functionaries in the government, etc. But it was initially thought to be not a political club. It subsequently became political, but it was a club which was the nucleus or the fulcrum for the rise of Naga consciousness. Then came the second work. Before that, let me come to, I put the Simon Commission and the memorandum. When the Simon Commission came as part of the Government of India reforms, the Naga Club, the members, they gave this memorandum, which is the basis of all the demands from the Naga groups, is that the Simon Commission, we very clearly said to the British government at that time, saying that we were always independent, the British had control over us, but when the British leave, we would like to go back to where we were and not be part of India. Then came the Second World War, again tremendous exposure to all the developments which were taking place. Fizo, in fact, was one of who joined the Indian National Army, imprisoned, and then he always said, I joined the Indian National Army to get independence not only for India but also for Nagaland. At that time, you had Sakri, who was also the Joint Secretary of the NNC, and both Fizo and Sakri, as I put it, they were brilliant in conceptualization of the Naga issue and their demand for sovereignty and as an independent nation. The work that they did among the Naga tribes, telling them of what was coming about, was something which I think people here in Delhi or even in Assam knew very little about. But because the entire Naga village was in one sense sovereign, they stayed on top of hills, they were sovereign in their own area, didn't care about anybody else. The issue that when the British would leave, the Nagas would come under the rule of Indians. And I think this is very important to understand in one sense, because while the Naga intellectuals put it as ruled by Indians, the real implication that it is not really ruled by Indians, but they were a part of India which would be ruling. So they are also a part of the ruling class, was never actually in one sense put forward by the Indian side very clearly. But from the Fizo and Sakri's issue, as they went around village to village, they said the entire Naga tribes and our culture, our land, etc. is under threat once the British leave and they would come under Indian rule. A number of studies have shown, we've had writings from various people which have said what they actually went and told these villagers. They told the villagers that you will have to, once you come as part of India, you will have to pay taxes. And you don't have the money to pay taxes, therefore you will have to sell your land. And as within a few years' time, all your land would be sold, and then you would become slaves. They also said that it's a Hindu India, therefore you would not be able to eat beef, you would not be able to eat pork. They also said it's a Hindu India, therefore Christianity, the church would be under attack, we would all get converted to Hinduism. And the onslaught of the large, they were just about at, in 1947, the total population of the Naga Hill district, I'm talking about, is just 2,13,000. And therefore, you had this 350 crore population of India, you would be just a minuscule this thing, and you just get swallowed up, and you would all become slaves. It is important to understand this because they very clearly, it struck a great resonance in the Naga mind. The Naga tribes, the people already were literally, in one sense, I want to say, they felt they were sovereign and had no masters. And what Fizo and Sakri and NNC really told them was, you will, if you come with us in one sense and you put together this, you are really in one sense back to where you were before. And therefore it struck a great resonance in the mind of the Naga people. On the other side, if you look at what was the attitude of the Indian elite or the Indian political class, as the creation of the Indian state in 1947 came, I think I'll just bring, okay, I'll come to that later. Creation of the Indian, we were actually in the process of nation building. You know, as people would know, you had the British India, you had 526 princely states, and the integration of the princely states, partition, the refugee fallout. There's a whole nation building exercise which is going on. You are aware, you know, we are trying to Jammu and Kashmir, Junagadh, you know, different, and then later on, you know, the Hyderabad action, army action in Hyderabad. So India was itself in the process of nation building, and the attention of the top leaders were primarily on the partition fallout and the integration of the princely states, the framing of the Indian constitution. Now, the framing of the Indian constitution, I want to again highlight one fact, that whereas almost, I think, every other group, whether it was even the backward tracts of Garrow Hills, you had Nicholson, Mizo, who were also, they all in one sense participated in the framing of Indian constitution. But the Naga did not. Even when they were invited to join the debate in the Constituent Assembly and to give their comments, they stayed out and said, we are not Indians, and therefore we have nothing to do with this. We would be a sovereign nation, and we just need our sovereignty to be recognized. They always said, we are not at war with India. Our intentions are completely peaceful. We just want to be left as the independent nation that we are. And this simultaneous rise of Naga nationalism was, in one sense, very poorly understood. And in a sense, you can understand from, because there was something which Fizo and others said, both Nagas and Indians know each other, hardly know each other, and therefore, you know, we need to know each other before, because we have nothing in common. We've had in Assam itself, the relationship between Assam at a number of levels with the Nagas was not something which was very good. You know, there are stories that, you know, Naga went down to the plains and the shadow fell upon the food which an Assamese was eating. He would throw it away, and he said it got polluted. It's that type of, you know, the folklore which is there to show that relationship. And you will see this happening. The result is that the Naga National Council declared their independence on August 14, 1947, one day before India. when the governor of Assam, the first Indian governor of Assam was appointed, they were trying to see how best they can negotiate, if you want to put it that way, come to an understanding with the Nagas. And when you had this Hyder Ali, who was the governor of Assam, he entered into what is called this 9-point agreement. Now I think the 9-point agreement, if it had, I think, come in and been accepted, it would have been a basis for, I think, you would have avoided all these 50 years of war and all the consequent tragedies that took place. But I think both sides, in one sense, had backed themselves into a position where there was too little communication, and it's a matter for us to reflect upon that when the 9-point, and it's actually the 9th point which is actually the most critical point, that when they said for a period of 10 years, this interim arrangement would be there, and then the Nagas would be free to choose, and you would sort of renegotiate or negotiate what their future would be. Now the difference was that at the end of 10 years, from the Indian side, if you want to put it that way, all thought at the end of 10 years, okay, some agreement, some modifications, and they will be part of the Indian Union and the Indian Constitution. From the Naga point of view, the 9th point was, it meant that at the end of 10 years, they will be free to become sovereign and declare their sovereignty. This transition arrangement was perhaps important because in the 10 years that this agreement, if it had been implemented, both sides would have understood what was really the issues of being part of the Indian Union, because there is a lot of words between being within the Indian Union and within the Indian Constitution itself. There is a lot of debate that if they are part of the Indian Union, the Constitution can come later. And after the 9-point Hyder Agreement, there was a lot of, if you see the literature across the board, people all said the Indian government has reneged on it.
What were the main features of 9 points?
Oh, you want to take it's basically there would be a separate area, the culture, land, etc. They would have the rights. Most of it is what is in the I would put it as in this earlier the 6th schedule when it came finally. And I'll tell you why the point. They would have the right to, they would have the whatever they pay for, they would be inclined to work on that. There would be a fixed grant from the government of India. There would be the village courts, traditional, etc. would be there. A number of points. I'm not coming to that because. But when the Constitution came, and this is again a point where perception, they didn't see the 9-point agreement in the Indian Constitution, and they felt let down. And on our side, we felt that bulk of the provisions of the 9-point agreement were included in the 6th schedule of the Constitution. But that was 6th schedule was for all the hill districts, not exclusively for the Nagas. And therefore, because it was not exclusively for the Nagas felt that this was something which the Indians had agreed, but actually reneged on that. 1951, there was a plebiscite for an independent sovereign Nagaland, which you see in all the writings. They talk of 99.99% of the Nagas voted for sovereignty.
Who organized the plebiscite? Who organized the plebiscite?
It is organized by the NNC, the Naga National Council. They were supposed to be that it was, they supposed to have had a document which had the thumb impression of 99.9% this thing. All my talks with all the elders and so on and so forth, nobody is aware of currently this location of so-called the plebiscite records. And 99.9%, a lot of people said it can't be 99.9% because women never voted at that time. The whole Tuansang area, they were out, they were part of NIFA at that time, so they didn't vote. The Nagas of Manipur didn't vote. So if really only in Mokokchung and Kohima districts people voted, then it's really not 99.9%. But if you talk to any Naga anywhere, this 99.9% is now, you can't get anybody to say it was not less than 99.9%. It's gone into the Naga psyche and the Naga mind itself. See, very interesting in one sense when the talks took place, all this, there is an element of an undercurrent at that time which said that what, in one sense, you might have had a success if at that time the government of India had said the Naga held districts would be administered by the center. And it's on record by some that when Fizo came and met the Chief Minister of Assam and the governor, he had actually said, in desperation, he said, will you put us under we would not like to be part of Assam, just take us like a union territory or under central administration, then you would still have a, but this was never agreed to by the Chief Minister of Assam, who is supposed to have, this is some record of the DC, there's nothing official record about it, but this is the DC of the Naga Hill districts, one Duncan, who said that this was the last desperate measure. Once that failed, you then really the breakdown, the violence started, and then of course the Indian Army moved into in 55, 56, and then you had really the next 8 years of a tremendous, what shall I say, a tragedy which took place in the whole of Nagaland. Indian Army went in. I don't think there are any official records, but there are official records from the Naga side in terms of the atrocities. There were burning of villages, there were torture, it was a very horrific period for the Nagas all over. Movement of grouping of villages, burning of granaries, and so on. It was, I think for the Indian Army, it must have been totally something new, of fighting jungle warfare in that area where they didn't know the terrain, and it took them, I think, years before they could really come to grips with it. And that is why the Naga consciousness, as I said, Naga consciousness was such that they were fighting for their land and their sovereignty and their independence. And I think it was something which there was a lot of, shall I say, a stalemate in one sense, if you want to put it, but personal tragedies and the trauma of that still continues even today. I know people who say that every time a jeep brakes suddenly outside their house, they actually start to tremble. That is a result of the army. There is a study recently documented by the Center for Northeast Studies which gives illustrations of what personal tragedies that many of the people had gone through. In the meantime, as this first 2 years of the war, in one sense, if you want to put it, which took place in this area, there were a number of, shall I say, progressive Nagas who felt that this violence was not really going anywhere. You had within the NNC itself people who felt at that time, and I think Sakri was one of those who felt that once the Indian Army came onto the scene, he said it is not something that is in the long-term interest of the Nagas. And he was one who felt that there was need for dialogue and for talks with the Indian government. He paid with his life for that. He was assassinated. And I think I always put it in one sense that his assassination, in one sense, is a watershed in Naga history, because his assassination, and he was as charismatic a leader as Fizo, really in one sense split the Naga society. And the Naga People's Convention of, shall I say, a lot of government servants and others who came out, they actually first said that they put up a demand for the separation of the Naga Hill district from Assam and the creation of what union territory or what was centrally administered. There were 3 meetings. I'm not getting into the details because I like to come into the current this thing. First, it was really basically a union territory. But then, between 57 and 59, when the 3rd meeting took place of the Naga People's Convention at Mokokcham, they upped the ante for a statehood. I've seen the files in the Ministry of Home Affairs, where first, when it came up, Nehru was very, he said, how can you give a state for a population of just about 3.67 lakhs? How will they survive, and so on and so forth, and the implications for other states, etc. There was a tremendous amount of debate within the government of India. You must know that all this, I have not mentioned, the entire discussions, negotiations which went on were all with the Ministry of External Affairs, because Nehru had a direct interest in this, and therefore you got the impression, which was finally corrected only in the late, actually 70, that you shifted the entire thing to the Ministry of Home Affairs. So you were actually having the Foreign Secretary negotiating, and therefore everybody, outside world could also think the Foreign Secretary is negotiating, then you are negotiating with a foreign entity and not part of an Indian entity itself. Then you had the 16-point agreement, which is like a precursor. They formed, in between they formed the NSTA, the Naga Hills Tuansang administration. The Tuansang district from the NEFA came in as part of joining the Naga Hill district, and then the creation of the state of Nagaland in 1963. And I put it as, in one sense, from the government of India point of view, I think the debate is still out. I still felt that this was one of the biggest strategic mistakes made by the government of India. Because once you gave statehood, and at that time, this Naga People's Convention was the overground element. Even though originally when the Naga People's Convention met, the underground elements were part of the need to bring about peace. At subsequent stage, the underground elements walked out of the NPC. And therefore, a lot of the officers at that time who made the recommendations, and I called Mr. Ramuni, one of the Indian Frontier Administrative Service, who was part of the 16-point this delegation which came, NPC delegation, they all told Nehru that give a state and the problem, Naga problem, is solved forever. Otherwise, Nehru would never have granted the state of Nagaland. He got convinced, I think, against his better will. But having given that, you can see that in 1963 you gave the state, I think in November or December the state was formed, and you had a ceasefire in 1964, started ceasefire. Because the underground element said statehood was not. If it was a deliberate strategic ploy from the NNC, and there was a federal government of Nagaland which was constituted in 1956, I think it was a very tremendous tactical move by them. That get a state and you still continue fighting for something more than a state. It was a very big success from their point of view, if you want to put it in the long-term point of view. Except that I think what they forgot was that in the Indian constitution, you only have a center and you have a state. There is nothing more than a state which could be given. Unlike the Mizo, which had a union territory, you could then promise a statehood and get Lal Denga to come in and have the Mizo peace accord, having given the state and not a union territory in 1963, Government of India really in one sense had very little to give thereafter. And it is one of the reasons why the negotiations went on for a very long time over the next 40, 50 years, because there was nothing really for Government of India to give beyond a state. And on the other side, they were asking for sovereignty. So violence broke out. There was a ceasefire from 1964. The peace mission that Jayaprakash Narayan, Michael Scott and Chalia and so on. Ceasefire actually held from 1964 to 1968. It was important that even though that ceasefire, you might say that in one sense, tactically it was bad, but for the first time since 1955, peace came to Naga. People could actually, when lights went out, people did not have to be afraid. Lanterns were lit in the night. People started going to schools and so on and so forth. So the period 64 to 68 was very important because there was a great yearning for peace. The damage to Naga society and Naga, the villages and so on was tremendous. And therefore there was this great yearning for peace, which actually in one sense, but if discussions with the federal government of Nagaland, which first took place when the Foreign Secretary Gundevia went to Kohima and along with the peace mission. In one sense, really you had nothing because so long as they were insisting on sovereignty, there was really nothing. Then the Naga undergrounds, in one sense, both Pakistan and Chinese help teams, groups went out. Factionalism increased because there was this groups which wanted ceasefire to continue and others who wanted a breakdown of ceasefire. In fact, the federal government of Nagaland itself broke into two on those who wanted a ceasefire extension. And then you had the talks in Delhi at the Prime Minister level. Having failed in Kohima with the Foreign Secretary, you had talks in India at Delhi at the Prime Minister level. I think the Naga underground and the FGN, I think committed the biggest blunder when they refused to take the offer which Indira Gandhi offered them. As Kato Siu says in his book, Indira Gandhi said, take everything except sovereignty. And they said, we want only sovereignty. And what the government of India in one sense offered them at that time, no government of India subsequently is in the political or otherwise position to even offer half of what was offered to them at that time. This is something which I think the Naga underground themselves know. During my discussions with them in 97 after the ceasefire, when I talked with Atem and I was telling him, I said, you lost the great opportunity. He agreed. He said, yes, we also realized that in the late 60s, if we had taken what Indira Gandhi had offered us, we would have gained something tremendously. And he also realized that, he said, I agree, that no government subsequently can offer what was offered by Indira Gandhi at that time. So there is a breakdown of talks. I'll quickly run through. There's a clampdown following the 1971 war, and then the tremendous pressure came on the forces, and a group split, and you had the 1975 Shillong Accord, where they accepted the Indian Constitution, talked of surrender of the armed forces and resettlement and so on. And then you had at that time, Muiwa and others were in China. There was a breakaway faction which they formed, the National Socialist Council of Nagaland. Within the group itself, because having gone to China, and China being a socialist country, and on one side you have Nagaland for Christ as a Christian country, there was a big split within the groups themselves, because who felt that we didn't want an atheist group over us. Then you had the breakup, the first factional fight when the NSC and Isaac Muba and Kaplan, they split. The whole history of the ambush and how Muba survived, and the hundreds of soldiers, the Naga army got killed. And the protracted army insurgency. And why? Because you had the state here, elections came, there were people, schools, colleges, development taking place. There was the Naga Mothers Association which came up with their slogan, "Shed no more blood." There was this yearning for peace, and increasing pressure on the NSC and IM. I think the Indian Army in one sense had by that time honed their fighting abilities to tackle the NSC and IM very well. And I remember 96-97 that we literally on every single day, we would get the self-styled home minister would be arrested, NSC and IM would appoint the next home minister, and we would arrest him within 24 hours. The next day, we would appoint one more person as defense minister, we will appoint him. There was tremendous pressure on them. Overtures for talks came up, and discussions took place at the Prime Minister level in a number of countries, from Netherlands to Tokyo and so on and so forth. And then this ceasefire came. I think the circumstances behind that peace talks and others, I think it really requires another session. But let me just put it that from the NSC and IM point of view, they announced that the conditions are talks will be held in a third country, talks will be held at the Prime Minister's level, and so on. And the talks will be only with the NSC and IM and nobody else for settling the Naga issue. The issue was so complicated as to what really took place, because it was done at a particular level. Nobody really knew what had actually been agreed to. And the NSC and IM came out with their propaganda on this, and it applies to the entire, all Naga held areas and so on and so forth, which subsequently we had to clarify and say that it does not apply. But I think the real success of that is that you were able to get a ceasefire with the most dominant faction. And in one sense, you are allowed peace to come into Nagaland. I'll come later how the importance of what takes place when peace comes and the implications of that on civil society, groups, tribes and so on. First we had the interlocutor Swaraj Kaushal, who was appointed. He was just there for a year. I think he proved to be, in one sense, a little bit of a disaster. He was removed. But Pillai came in as interlocutor, stayed almost 10 years. And there was a group of ministers also, Oscar Fernandez and others. This process of discussions which they took place, it was because first it was meetings were abroad, then finally Muiba came in, he accepted an Indian passport, he's got a bungalow in Lodi estate, he's allowed to move around and so on, come back. The period was meant in one sense to, I think a lot of time was in one sense wasted, but it also, you can't say it was wasted because it was, they got a chance to see the working of the Indian democracy, the Indian state from close quarters across a large group of people. And then R.S. Pandey, who was the former Chief Secretary of Nagaland, was appointed as the interlocutor when I was the Union Home Secretary. R.S. Pandey is a close friend and a batchmate of mine from the Nagaland cadre. He has been PC in Mon and communitization program, well respected, tremendous reputation. And he was in one sense able to develop an atmosphere of trust with the NSC and IM and Muiba. And therefore we were able to get a considerable amount of progress on the talks. And I'm coming Now you see why the reasons for the long time for talks in what prior to 2009, the reason. In this talk, the talks when it started, the basic understanding was these talks would be with respect and honor. And I mentioned the unique history of the Nagas which they were talking about. On one side, people might say that what is the uniqueness about it? In one sense, they are being the joke. The uniqueness about it is that they had no history. But there is a unique history in terms of the developments which took place in the last century vis-a-vis India. And I think what we wanted to make sure and what we wanted as that these talks would take place and the settlement would be such that there would be respect and honor on both sides. And a greater understanding of what is possible. See, when they came and sovereignty itself, it took a long time for us to be able to discuss with the NSA and IM on what is sovereignty. And then the issue came up of actually saying that to an extent you are already sovereign. Because in the Indian context, we have the concept of what is known as shared sovereignty. The center is sovereign in some list 1, the state is sovereign in terms of list 2. You see subjects like police, the state is sovereign in that field. There are so many areas where the state is sovereign. Therefore we said, in one sense, when you got statehood, you already got part sovereignty. And that issue of discussing with them on getting the concept of shared sovereignty understood and as a basis for discussion took some time. I may say that even constitutional experts from other countries, from South Africa and so on, were brought in by the NSA and IM, had discussions with us in the Ministry of Home Affairs, with our law officers and so on. For that, they didn't have to listen to what we had to say. They could get an independent opinion from others as to this concept of shared sovereignty and the working of the Indian Constitution. Then the issue came up because of this long battle time which had taken place. Many of the, what shall I say, inherent contradictions in the system started to come out. You had the Naga tribalism. The tribe, in the Naga context, the first loyalty, even though it was to the Naga issue, the first loyalty in one sense was still to the tribe. There are lots of histories you find written by the Nagas themselves, so it's not something which I am trying to bring out. And it was there when the federal government of Nagaland was there, the splits which took place, the various tribal issues that came up, and how it in one sense harmed their movement because they were not able to get the unity which was there, and therefore it was a struggle for unity. And that we had also realized that there are a large number of the stakeholders to a final settlement, which included the neighbouring states of Manipur, Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, and therefore the issue. There was a 31-point memorandum which was given by the NSA and IM, and when people talk, the discussions in the government are that it is discussed in the ministry, then we prepare a note for the Cabinet Committee on Security. The Cabinet Committee on Security finally gives the negotiating brief, which is then passed on to the interlocutor. There is counter proposals and further proposals, and then the negotiations take place on a number of items. So it is not something as though the interlocutor is just sitting and talking. He is basically talking on behalf of the Cabinet Committee on Security in terms of the mandate which is given to him. And it's not something, it's a one point, it's a reiterative. As issues come up and you need a clarification or you need an approval from the Cabinet Committee on Security, it comes back and forth, it goes back.